All right, so welcome to um, Business Law, Spokane Community College. My name is Jim McLean, and I'm the business law instructor for the day and online classes, evening if we need them. And so I just welcome you to the class, and what we're going to do here is we're going to lecture off of the PowerPoints and the book. You should have the book handy. I'll be making some references to the book, but we won't have any pictures of the book. So we'll just basically just go off the PowerPoints and my lecture. And the purpose of the lecture is to provide kind of a review of the what I feel are the main concepts of the chapter. In this case, it's chapter 1, and these are the ones that you have to study for testing. We will go through most of the cases as well, but I prepare the tests and I don't test on the cases as such unless it appears in some content material or article or note or something like that. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to go through the just scroll through the learning objectives, and we'll go right into definition of law, which starts on page 3 of the text. And this is pretty self-explanatory as far as the definition is concerned. Law is essentially, as is pointed out here, a body of rules that is prescribed by the controlling authority. And the controlling authority then, in our case, is the government, the democratically elected government, but in some countries it might be the royal family or a dictator or whatever. But then the controlling authority has to have the ability to enforce the law and subject the lawbreakers to sanctions and so forth. So that's why that second point points out sanctions or consequences for essentially breaking the law. Now, as far as what this next screen has to do with what we use the law for, the functions of law, and then the text. If you turn the page, the text is good as far as giving you an example of each of these functions. But we use law to keep the peace. That's primarily the function of criminal law, for example, shaping moral standards. And they have good examples in the book here as far as if to help you, understand what that means. Shaping moral standards would be like drug and alcohol laws, to try to social control. Promote social justice would be like discrimination laws. Maintaining the status quo is where we have laws that, when they take effect, then we generally want to keep what we have. And the example they give is like, restricting the overthrow of the government. Laws that are also used to facilitate orderly change, like, your mortgage, your real estate laws, rental agreements, things like that are designed to, keep things, the way they are, but also allow for terminations and sales and things like that. Let's take a look at the book. Talks about commercial law. Let's see. Yeah, commercial laws and business. No, that's the facilitating planning, which would be, like commercial laws and business, but also facilitating planning would be examples I like to use, like Medicare, your benefits laws, Medicare, Social Security, and so forth. People use these laws to plan their retirement and so forth. We use laws to provide for compromise of claims. Most, we'll emphasize in the course here that most disputes that arise under the law are compromised. They're settled. The vast majority of laws are settled, and we'll get into some statistics. The vast majority of claims are settled. We'll get into some statistics on that during the course. And we also have constitutional laws. Bill of Rights is the example of laws that provide for individual freedom. Okay, now we're going to take a look at the qualities of essentially the qualities of our American legal system, which the two characteristics that we're discussing here are fairness and flexibility. Fairness is discussed on the bottom of page 4, and there's an example for you there, but essentially, the fact that we've been a country without disruption, we've had a civil war, but pretty much we've been able to keep everything together since this Constitution took effect, is because we have a fair system. A fair legal system is the primary function of keeping people together and keeping a country together. As far as flexibility is concerned, a legal system that's going to be long-standing like ours has to provide for changes in the law. And so when things change, when there is technological change or social change in a society, then the law has to change. The example that the book gives on this is on page 5, the Brown versus Board of Education case that desegregated schools after World War II. So one of the things historically that you'll see in the law is that I usually use World War II as the period for where we had a substantial change in the law after World War II from what we had before World War II. So if you read the note on the bottom of page 5, you'll see that, for example, school segregation was legal, and the segregation of public facilities was legal in our country until the Brown case was decided in 1954. So we had the separate but equal rule that took effect in 1896, although that was just a precedent set. We still had a segregated society before that time. And then the Brown case began the integration of races in our society after the World War II in 1954. So make sure you read that. Next set of concepts here deals with the schools of jurisprudential thought. So I'm going to skip over this case and the screen. Don't worry about that for testing. And I'm going to go right to schools of jurisprudential thought and spend a little time on that. We're not going to cover, or you're not going to be responsible for every one of these schools, and there are quite a few of them. But first of all, by jurisprudential thought, what that has to do with really is philosophies of law. The different philosophies of law that have influenced the laws that we have. That's what we're going to cover here. And as you can see as you go through the screens, there are a number of different philosophies of law. Now we're going to focus on what I feel are the two main philosophies, and that is natural law and the command school up here. Okay, that's what we're going to primarily focus on. And I would say these are the two main ones. Now, the natural law is, I think one of the easiest ones to understand. I mean, both of those are fairly easy concepts, I think. But the natural law school just focuses primarily on not so much. I know they have morality and ethics and everything. All law deals with that. But what the natural law school teaches essentially, and this is a little different than how the textbook approaches it, that law is created by a higher authority, and if with respect to the pure natural law view is that it is based on some sort of higher authority than man, and consequently that's where religion comes into play with respect to our legal system. So in our country, for example, we have law that's based on the natural law, and if you look at where it comes from, it primarily comes from Christianity and the influences of Christianity on our society. So, that's where we get a lot of our morality and ethics and so forth. And so when you want to label to say, well, where does this law come from? It's the natural law school of jurisprudential thought. And in the United States, especially at the beginning of our history, after the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution and so forth is heavily based on the natural law. Going further back into English common law, the English common law system, it would be the Magna Carta. That would be heavily based on natural law. And now, as the opposite view of the natural law view is the command school, and that is discussed on the bottom of page 7 in the chapter. But the author, even though the author uses command school, I think the popular name for this school is the positive law school. Most textbooks refer to it as the positive law view, or the positive law view of jurisprudential thought. And the positive law view essentially takes the position that there is no natural law as such, which is a higher order, you might say, than man, like religion, but all law is, under the command school or positive law view, all law is man-made, essentially. And that's why they mention, that it is made and enforced by the ruling party. That's a little confusing. It's basically, in a democratic society like ours, it's going to be made by our democratically elected government. And that's where our law comes from. But again, it still is influenced by the natural law. So those are the two schools of jurisprudential thought that you should be familiar with. Okay, now from there we go into history, the history of our American legal system, which we essentially got from the English, because we were, as everybody knows from their history, former English colonies. And and then when we were colonies, we used the English common law as our primary basis of law to resolve disputes and so forth. So the English common law was created by the English, as we'll see in a little bit later, but in this chapter. And then it, it was exported. I use the term it was exported to the United States by the colonists that colonized the United States and the King of England. And so when we had our revolution and took over the country, essentially, the English common law was here, so we used that as our legal basis. And all the states, legal starting point, so to speak, and all the states that became part of the Union later, like Washington State, which is about 100 years later, territory and then a state, we to this day have in our statutes and so forth state that the English common law is essentially the law of the land. But we've really over time developed our own common law. Now, the English common law on this screen, they point out where it comes from, and it came from the judges, the English judges that in their decision-making process set precedents while they were deciding disputes. That's what this screen deals with. So principles announced in cases became precedent, and later judges then applied them to similar cases. So that's how the English common law developed. I don't want to worry about the courts of England. That's this screen. I'm going to skip that material. And we'll move to the sources of law. Now, as far as where our common law or where the common law fits into our sources of law, just so we have a smooth transition here, I'm going to jump ahead a minute to judicial decisions and the doctrine of stare decisis. So this is the American common law. It's created by, it is a primary source of law. It's created by our courts, by our judges, and the higher courts, the appeals courts, set precedents, and these precedents are followed by the lower courts under the doctrine of stare decisis. And stare decisis is Latin for let the decision stand. Okay, we're going to back up here to the different sources of law here, starting with the Constitution. This discussion again starts on page 11. And by the way, on page 10, the bottom of page 10, there's a little note talking about the adoption of English common law in the United States. So I would encourage you to read that. And also the European civil law system on the top of page 11. I would encourage you to read both of those just to get a feel for where the law came from in both Europe and in England and in the United States. Okay, as far as sources of law goes, we've got the highest source of law in the United States is the federal constitutional law. That's introduced on this screen, and it is the supreme law of the land. And any law that conflicts with it can be declared unconstitutional. And we have a case example on this declaring a law to be unconstitutional on page 17. I would encourage you to take a look at that case. It's Shelby County versus Holder. And that is an example of how the Supreme Court can declare laws to be unconstitutional. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next screen and get into treaties as a source of law. And treaties involve agreements between countries, and they are also the supreme law of the land. The treaties are international agreements negotiated essentially by the president, but they have to be approved by 2/3 vote of the Senate before they become law. Now, an example of a treaty would be like the NATO, North Atlantic organization that we have. As far as a defense treaty, we have a treaty involving the United Nations. We have one that, since we just had an election, here we had, lots of talk about trade agreements like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. That's another example of a treaty, and we will cover those all in the last chapter. We will cover treaties in the very last chapter of the book, and the very end of the course. Another source of law is federal statutes. This is on page 12. And federal statutes are laws made by Congress, and they're found in code books. And in our library here at Spokane Community College, we have the Federal Statute Code, United States Code, USC for short, United States Code. And these are statutes or laws made by Congress, and they're signed by the president to become law, unless they're vetoed, and then we'll get into that a little bit later. There are state statutes also and state code books, just like the federal law. So Washington State has a state legislature. We elect, just like our Congress, and they vote on laws that are called state statutes, and they are put into our state code, which is called the Revised Code of Washington. State or city and county laws are called ordinances, and they're put in municipal codes. So they're similar to statutes, but they only apply locally. Executive orders are laws made by the president and state governors. And right now, since we just had an election, we have a new president, President Donald Trump, and he, since this is in fact, I'm making this video right after the election in January, and one of the first things he's doing is he's issuing executive orders. So executive orders are official statements made by the president. They're actually intended to be actual laws that we have to follow. But as far as some presidents use them for other purposes. But we won't get into that during this time. It's more of a political issue. Regulations are laws made by administrative agencies, and we have administrative agencies at the federal, state, and local level. These rules that are discussed in the book, or regulations, are laws made by federal agencies, is what the examples that they give, and they're put in these are an example of a federal agency would be like the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, or EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. All of these would be examples of agencies, federal agencies, Department of Education, and so forth, and they pass regulations that are put in an administrative code, which we call the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, and then as far as judicial decisions, we said they make up the American common law. Stare decisis is Latin to say let the decision stand, and the lower courts then are supposed to follow the precedent rulings of the higher courts, like, for example, the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to cover here has to do with the priority of law, and our discussion of sources of law has been kind of in the not exactly as far as the priority goes, but this screen tells you that the highest law, the supreme law of the land, is going to be the Constitution, federal Constitution, and treaties, and then statutes are under that, federal statutes, and then federal regulations would be under that. But before the federal regulations, it really would be federal court decisions or federal common law, which they don't really like to talk about. But if we're looking at the state level, you'd have the same priority of law. You'd have constitutional law of the state. You'd have state statutes. And then the third one would be court cases, common law. And then you'd have your regulations, your administrative regulations. Okay, so this is, another screen on priority. And then we get into, the author gets into digital law and some miscellaneous concepts, which I would encourage you to take a look at, but I'm not going to include them for content for the test, the upcoming test on these chapters. And we will have a test over chapters 1 through 7. So part of what we're going to use this my lecture videos for is to narrow down the material, but we also increase some of the material, as you noticed, or as we go through, if I feel that some concepts are not adequately covered by the PowerPoints. Okay, but so that's the end of the video lecture on chapter 1. I hope it was helpful, and don't be afraid to contact me if you have any questions by phone or email, which you can find in Canvas. Okay, that's it for the lecture.